Are you ready to witness Jordan Peterson schooling loud activists? As gender identity becomes an increasingly debated topic in our modern societies, governments are seeking to increase their interference in our lives through mandating us to use gender-correct language. But Jordan Peterson wouldn't have any of that and went on multiple interviews to show why such an approach is wrong and sets us on a dangerous path, especially after the Canadian government passed Bill C-16, which imposes fines on citizens for misgendering someone. But before I go on with the video, watch this clip.
Pronoun misuse may become actionable through the human rights tribunals and the courts, and the remedies, monetary damages, non-financial remedies, for example, ceasing the discriminatory practice or reinstatement to the job, and public interest remedies, for example, changing hiring practices or developing non-discriminatory policies and procedures. Jail time is not one of them. Jordan, you're not going to go to jail if you keep this up. Do you find that reassuring?
What if I don't pay the fine?
Then what? Can someone please explain to Jordan B. Peterson that there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom from consequence? Do you agree there's a difference?
Well, certainly there's a difference.
And are you prepared to suffer the consequences that society may deem you need to suffer because of your views?
Yes, I'm prepared to do that.
What does that entail?
Are you open to learning?
Well, hang on.
That's not the question.
Hang on, that wasn't the question.
It's
That's
true.
right.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, and that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns, then I would be willing to reconsider my position. But I'm also partly opposed to this because it's been made mandatory and has the whole weight of the law behind it. It's like, this is a very bad idea. I believe this is a very bad idea. And I believe that the reason this has caused so much noise, tremendous amount of noise, tremendous amount of attention on YouTube, is because there are things that are at stake in this discussion, despite its surface nature, that strike at the very heart of our civilization.
That's what you get from the woke left when you face them with facts. They couldn't just get the majority of society to play along with the pronoun game, so they went ahead and made a law that mandates people to use gender-correct pronouns when talking with someone who identifies in a certain way. By the way, subscribe for more discussions like this. I think we should remind the left and its activist groups that just as it is important to honor any individual's choice to be referred to by any non-traditional or newly introduced pronouns, it is equally important to respect those who prefer sticking to traditional and grammatically correct usage of those pronouns. You can't scream that people are showcasing intolerant or non-inclusive behavior while simultaneously engaging in such behavior yourself. The main reason why humans are using languages is that it facilitates efficient and clear communication. Now, if countless numbers of pronouns are added into the mix, that would lead to communication becoming complex and unclear, which is not practical for everyday interaction. Additionally, language and its use are deeply embedded in cultural and societal norms, which vary widely across the world. In many cultures and languages, the pronouns he and she are deeply integrated and widely accepted. Respecting those pronouns, therefore, also means respecting the linguistic and cultural frameworks within which they operate. The most important point is that we live in democratic societies, and the left's insistence on everyone adopting such novelty in language will only alienate those who hold traditional views on language use. This in turn would create divide and confusion because, remember, no one was talking about such insignificant issues even a decade ago. Our discourse has regressed so much that we give space for such topics instead of focusing on how to further improve our lives and focusing on things that once used to matter.
Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considering. These are really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They weren't my friends. Just because you know a few people, just because you've talked to a few trans people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Pete, Professor Pete, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right. So, the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected you either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself and on behalf of other people, perhaps, who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. And so I'm not taking...
But Professor Peterson, let me jump in there, though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use anymore.
Not by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion.
While we can't deny that language evolves with time, one can't make the argument that this evolution can be achieved forcefully through laws mandated by the government. This process takes years, if not decades. However, this evolution, particularly in the context of introducing a diverse array of gender pronouns, raises important questions when considered for legal or regulatory enforcement in everyday language usage. Specifically, the question of whether laws should mandate citizens to move away from using traditional binary pronouns like he or she in favor of newer non-binary options. Additionally, the principle of freedom of speech lies at the core of democratic societies, which includes the right to choose one's words. Imposing legal constraints on the use of specific pronouns is a direct infringement on this freedom. While it is essential to respect everyone regardless of how they identify, turning this issue into a rigid legal one will lead to concerns over compelled speech, which contradicts with constitutional rights in many countries. This is purely government intervention on the personal lives of citizens, setting a precedent where the government can mandate the language that must be used in private interactions, will lead to broader implications for free speech. Once it becomes acceptable to legislate the words that individuals must use, it opens the door to potentially more invasive regulations that could govern other aspects of speech and expression. This slippery slope leads to increased governmental control over individual expression in other areas. I think we should be extremely careful because the old saying goes, you give an inch, they take a mile. There's also a critical issue that happens in trans communities, as Peterson pointed out, which is unhinged activists proclaiming the position of representing the whole community in the media. This could be characterized as pure opportunism. For instance, take the op-ed on CBC by Jessica Triff, who is a trans person, noting, and I quote, "Personally, I found this toxic in-your-face activism overly confrontational. I believe it creates more, not less, animosity toward the trans community. Adding any trans person like myself who doesn't agree with this type of activism and doesn't jump onto the defamatory labeling of anyone who disagrees as a bigot."
Do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. You know, I don't know what that means. What do you mean a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, you know, it depends what you think a real woman is, but do you think a trans woman is a woman?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition. And I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense. Because what do you mean by real?
Well, I mean, you've just clarified that, though. You don't think that a trans woman is a woman. And do you think that that is what is behind or explains your opposition to this idea of a law mandating you to use a preferred pronoun, is because you don't actually believe that that's the truth, that a trans woman is a woman and therefore you can't use that pronoun?
No, that's not my argument at all.
Really?
Yeah, really. My argument is that the government shouldn't compel voluntary speech.
No, but I know what your argument is, and you've made it very
really
clearly.
But that's exactly it. There's no
motivation
behind it.
But you don't believe
I wouldn't put everything on online in my life to take the stance I did unless I had thought that through very deeply. And I've thought it through very deeply. There aren't hidden motivations that have to do with some arbitrary prejudice against trans people.
Okay.
It's pure and simply this. There's never been a time in English common law history where the government compelled speech, and the Canadian government dared to do that. And that was unacceptable. And they masked it with this show of compassion for the oppressed, and I don't buy it.
All I could hear this continuing deflection from this interviewer while trying to push her woke agenda. She couldn't even answer what a woman is. It's also important to note that when the MSM quickly labels individuals as transphobic for their views on pronouns, it risks shutting down open conversation that could lead to greater understanding and acceptance. If people fear being branded with such a harsh label, they choose to avoid the discussion entirely rather than engaging in a constructive dialogue. Additionally, labeling people as transphobic because of their pronoun preferences contributing to further polarizing within society. This approach entrenches people in their positions, leading to greater societal division. In a polarized environment, the opportunity for understanding is diminished, as individuals are more likely to retreat into defensive postures rather than engaging in meaningful exchanges that could lead to change. But I think that's their goal in the first place, punishing and shuttering down the loudest dissenters so that others learn from them, and therefore only the woke left narratives take over our discourse. Those on the left need to understand that for true progress in society addresses and respects gender diversity, there must be an underlying foundation of genuine acceptance and voluntary change. Language changes most effectively when it evolves naturally, reflecting the consensus and collective behavior of its speakers. When changes are organic, they are more likely to be widely accepted and integrated to everyday use. Legal mandates to accelerate this process can be seen as artificial and will surely be met with resistance.